Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about Autechre and their second album, Amber. So now we're getting into the album that first introduced me to Autechre in the first place. I remember years ago finding out about them in high school through a recommendation on a Pandora station, and at that point I had already had a pretty good track record for getting good recommendations from that site. I'd already discovered Hybrid and Sounds from the Ground from there, and they're still two of my favorite bands ever. The track Slip showed up, and I was like, this sounds kinda cool, I'll give them a shot. And I got more of an idea on how much hype they had afterwards as I bought Amber on iTunes. This was right around the same time as I was checking out Boards of Canada for the first time as well, I believe. Now, at the time, I thought Amber was pretty good. Didn't love it. Something kind of fell off about it that I couldn't really put my finger on, and only a couple of select tracks really stuck with me. Of course, that was years ago. Music Has the Right to Children wasn't completely clicking for me at that time, and we all know how I feel about that album now. Amber has had plenty of years to sit with me and grow on me, and now I do have more defined feelings on it, and my current thoughts are, this is a very good project, if not quite a great one. In one breath, Amber stylistically is just kind of Incunabula again. It follows a lot of the typical 90s artificial intelligence style synth tones and textures, but it also has a very different vibe, one that I think was more intentional and well crafted than Incunabula. It does a lot more work towards mood building and creating this kind of dark and desolate and lonely atmosphere. It sounds like it takes place on some deserted alien planet. I've heard somewhere that Rob and Sean consider Incunabula more of a compilation, with this project more of a well-realized album, and yeah, I can see that. But I've also heard that they made this the way they did, since Warp wanted them to follow up Incunabula in 6 months, and I don't know, I can see that as well, if to a lesser extent. This is a more popular choice for Best Autechre album than their debut as well. Probably a more cool choice, I suppose. I personally, though, feel like it's a bit of a mixed bag. No tracks I outright dislike, and it does in fact have a couple of my favorite tracks from these guys ever, but there's also quite a few tracks that just kind of blend into the background without doing much for me or really sticking in my memory. It's a much more ephemeral project than their debut for me, and I don't nearly as frequently feel the urge to come back to it. I will say the album is maybe a little front-loaded. Most of my favorite stuff from this project is near the beginning. Well, the actual opener, Foil, I've always been kinda on and off with. It's nothing more than a spooky, glassy, dissonant synth pad and some strange NES game percussion noises that fire off at regular intervals. I can't say I've ever disliked this track. For one thing, I can easily recall the way it sounds and play it back in my head, and that is a major plus that not many tracks from these guys can attest to. It's just kind of a weird place to start the album, I guess. It's not exactly the kind of opener that really gets me hyped to get into the rest of the project. It's low-key and unnerving and alien-sounding in a way that I'm not always totally in the mood for, but it's still cool. I like it. It's the album's next couple of tracks that are a lot stronger in my eyes. Montreal does in fact bring in some proper melody, even if it is similarly alien and unnerving. Got some sparse bass lines, icy leads, ghostly pad progressions, and rollicking mechanical percussion loops. It sounds really nice and much more consistently has me invested. And the album peaks early with the third track, Silverside. One of the few Autechre tracks that consistently gets an emotional response out of me, and a fairly strong one at that. All these faux orchestral string pads are absolutely beautiful, and they create this really haunting vibe, while there's all these deep, garbled voices that make weird, unintelligible noises, and the percussion just kind of marches along with them. Easily my favorite track in the bunch. This one's always stuck with me. And then Slip, as I mentioned earlier, was the first Autechre track I ever heard, so it kind of gets points automatically that way. But it is interestingly a turn for some more pleasant, major key and upbeat tones. If the previous 3 tracks felt like they took you out to some alien desert planet, this one does have some interesting sense of welcoming familiarity to it, while not actually feeling out of place alongside these stranger and more foreboding tracks. There's very few tracks out there from these guys that are capable of putting me in a better mood, but this is one of them. After this, there's a stretch of tracks that are cool, but tend not to really stick with me, and mostly just disappear from my head after they're done. I will say Glitch has been more of a grower than I would have expected. Much like Foil, there's barely any tonal melody, but it does have more energy, with all these undulating synth patterns that bubble and boil, and a fairly fast-paced percussion track underneath. Maybe a little repetitive, but it is pretty cool to listen to. Then there's Piezo. They've done worse pronunciation-wise. A track that I've been told I should really love, but I don't know. It doesn't really stick with me. It is roughly as energetic as Glitch, with its galumphing and almost percussive synth patterns going up next to its actual drum machines, keeping a pretty fast-paced foot-tapping pulse, while these kind of unnerving melodic pads eventually develop underneath and kind of vaguely remind me of Matchsticks, the final track on Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, though noticeably sparser than those pads. See, when I have all that described on paper, it sounds really cool, and it is cool when I'm actually paying attention to it. It's not a track that grabs my attention by itself, though. And it blends completely seamlessly into a beatless interlude, 9, which has all these plucking melodic textures and a pervading sense of melancholia. Fits with the spooky vibe of the rest of the album, but again, I almost never actually noticed this track is even there. The album does kind of pick back up for me after this, though. Further is the longest track in the bunch at over 10 minutes, even if it doesn't actually feel any longer than the other tracks here. It does have a blend of all these plucking synths that sound kind of like water droplets dripping in a cavern, alongside some ghostly pads, a banging ambient techno beat that gives me a bit of a Monolake vibe, even though Monolake wasn't actually around yet at this point. And there's these cool synth textures that sound like reversed horns and metallic sighing, I guess. This track does feel like it has some dramatic heft and weight to it. I feel like it's a more compelling and textured companion to Piezo or that one. Good stuff. And then Yulquen. That's an interesting one, more stripped back, and its synth tones are strangely warm and intimate, have a delicate feel to them, like those on the opening seconds of Boards of Canada's Turquoise Hexagon Sun, which was also not out yet. But they are deeper and marginally more spacious than those as well. A nice comforting break from the cold desolation of the rest of the album, even if that coldness is still felt to some extent. Then there's Nil, another track that doesn't stick out to me, but unlike Piezo or 9, it doesn't really impress me more when I do really pay attention to it. It's a more beat-focused track, but it kind of feels emotionally dry and like any other artificial intelligence type track. Got whirring bassy pads and melodic leads that I guess BOC would improve upon with Pete standing alone, and a clattering beat that feels rather standard. It's not out of place, doesn't weigh down the album or feel like unnecessary filler, but I can't say I think it's anything all that special, personally. Thankfully, though, we do end on a much stronger and more impactful moment. The closer, Teartear, does have a real sense of foreboding menace, as its crunching beats march towards you alongside its dark synth progressions and other squeaking textures around it. I think there's even a couple of MIDI xylophones in the background, too. And there's also a really cool change-up like halfway through where the tempo just gradually slows down. That's pretty awesome, I will say. Even if I kind of wish the track didn't unceremoniously end in a fade-out. But yeah, that's every track on Amber. I do think this album is generally better to remember than Incunabula, and while I personally feel that that album is stronger and more memorable and I have more fun coming back to, this project does have some definite strengths over that one. It does have a much better command over its mood. It feels like it does have more of a defined flavor and an experience you can't get elsewhere. It has a sense of environment to it, despite being made out of all these synth textures that are still fairly conventional for the time. One that, like I mentioned, is very alien and foreboding and chilling and not really of this earth. You could tell me that this project just completely smokes Incunabula for you, and I would be like, yeah, I get you. But I personally don't put this one on nearly as often. Like, I don't know, I guess it's kind of a downer. It's not as fun for me to come back to. Like, there are some excellent moments here that I do still like coming back to. Silverside is still untouchable in my eyes and one of my all-time favorite tracks of theirs. And, you know, Amber as a whole is still going to be staying on my iPod. I still think it's a very good project, and even the weakest moments aren't outright bad, just kind of forgettable. But yeah, while I get the people that feel this was an improvement on Incunabula, it doesn't quite hit greatness for me as a whole. Still worth giving a shot, of course. It's still much easier to get into and more accessible than the vast majority of stuff they released afterwards, but maybe not the highest on my personal ranking of their stuff. Overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.